So if you missed today's class, we went over the chapter 7 terms that hopefully you remember from the last couple of weeks together. Now, if you don't remember all of these, it's okay as long as you know them for May. So these are the terms that you will need to know, and the first term is the Protestant Reformation, major turning point. And I think you remember the story how Martin Luther nailed the 95 Thesis to the church door at Wittenberg. His bosses said, "Take back 41." They brought him before his people at the Diet of Worms. He refused to take it back. They excommunicated him. So, those who agreed with Martin Luther, and the printing press was fairly new, people could read or probably more likely have it read to them. If you agreed with what he wrote, you became a Protestant. If you disagreed, you remained a Catholic. And the big point, he insisted that people read their Bible in the vernacular. So, what this brought was literacy, because if you can read a Bible, you can read everything else. And in terms of the man himself, he was a monk, and the story was he was stuck in a lightning storm. And he dropped to his knees and he said, "God, if you get me out of here, I will be a monk." And he kept his word. Now, what really upset him was the practices of simony and selling of indulgences, where wealthy people could buy favors from the church with simony, or even worse, buying your way into heaven. And that was the catalyst for him to write the 95 Theses. Now, in the end, when it was all said and done with, Christianity had broken into its third division. It started with the Roman Catholics, and then the Great Schism of 1054 brought Orthodox, and then in 1517 we have the Reformation. Now, the 30 Years' War related to that because people took their religion very seriously, but even probably more so, the political power was wrapped up with the religion. So the 30 Years' War was primarily a religious struggle, but it was the politics that went along with it. And 8 million casualties, 30 years, you can see how serious it was. And the 30 Years' War fits under a broader umbrella of counter Reformation. And here's a stimulus that hopefully we see in May, the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre, and you can see the violence associated with this counter Reformation, Catholic versus Protestant, and it's still lingering to this day, believe it or not. Now we're going to go over to the Americas and Taki Khoi. Now, this was a solidarity movement of the Inca people, where these people were trying to keep their culture, keep their rituals, keep their practices against this onslaught of the Spanish. Now, unfortunately for them, smallpox decimated a good amount of the Inca. But I think on a deeper level, it created this notion of solidarity of Mesoamericans and native people, which probably needed to take place considering how destructive the Spanish arrival was. So you can kind of see the theme of this particular chapter is cultural diffusion and syncretism. When people mix, what happened? Now, syncretism in relation to religion, and cultural diffusion in relation to something like this. Okay. Now, the Jesuits, speaking of syncretism, now the Jesuits went into China to try to convert them. Now, although there's 25 million people in China today, China by and large rejects Christianity because of its well established. I mean, China, very, very old nation. It had its philosophies, its legalism, and its Moism, and its Confucianism. So the Jesuits did make some inroads, and what they did is they used math and astronomy to get the Chinese scholars involved, and then once they got the intellectual side, to get the religious side. But in the end, Christianity didn't take hold in China like it did a lot of places. Okay, now Wahhabi Islam. Now we're moving to the Middle East. Now, Wahhabi Islam is a very strict, very fundamentalist form of Islam, and it's named after its founder, Wahhab. Now, this strict dogmatic form had particular influence in Saudi Arabia. Now, some Islamic nations like Indonesia, a lot more moderate, did not adopt this Wahhabi style of Islam. But you can look at any regime today that's a very strict dogmatic Islamic nation, and you can trace it to the Wahhabi movement. Another example of syncretism. Wang Yangming. Now, Wang Yangming, we're in China here now. We're jumping all around in this chapter. Now, this was a man that created something. Now, neo, the prefix neo means new. So bear in mind, Confucianism, an ancient belief practice, he turned it on its head and he broke from that rigid five principle rules into a more individualistic, a more secular form of Confucianism. And Modern China is a fairly secular nation, and I think it's a fair argument to say you can trace it to Wang Yangming and his new philosophy in regards to Confucianism. Now, Kaozheng literally means based on evidence, and some sharper people in class said, hey, this reminds me of the scientific revolution and enlightenment that happened in Europe. And I don't think that's a bad point at all because both of them placed emphasis on analysis and empiricism. So if you combine Cao Zheng with Wang Yangming, you can see how this was the foundation of a secular empirical Chinese thinking system more so than its um, faith-based systems. Now, the dream of the Red Chamber, this is total AP. I don't think you'll ever see this in a regular history class, but it was a story, okay? It's an 18th century Chinese story, and it's considered one of the four great classical novels of Chinese literature. So China has its four great inventions, compass, gunpowder, paper, and ink, but it has its four great pieces of Chinese literature. This is probably the best well known. And what this does, it shows, or what this did, I should say, was showed Chinese culture. It personified Chinese culture, gave the depth of Chinese culture. And it's not, I think, another on a bigger level. It's an example of humanities where a book takes on a deeper significance. So this is deeper than just a book. And you could say the same thing in U.S. history with Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms of the abolition movement, or in terms of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, which really changed people's perspectives of the afterlife, that sort of thing. The Dream of Red Chamber, synonymous with China and their literary prowess, I guess. Okay, now we're jumping all around. Now we are heading to India for Mirabai. Now, she was a mystic, meaning she was a holy person, and she's synonymous with the Bhakti movement. And if you recall the Bhakti movement, this was a form of Hinduism that emphasized the unity of all the different gods and the surrender and this brotherhood and devotion. So she's probably the most well known of this movement. And what we're seeing during this time period, this 1450 to 1750 time period, long-standing religious practices and beliefs and scientific long-standing practices and beliefs are getting changed through cultural diffusion and syncretism. Okay, Sikhism. Now, a lot of people have seen Sikhs in Metro Detroit and they think they're Muslims. They are not Muslims. They are a separate religious group. As a matter of fact, the fifth largest in the world. So, what the Sikhs believe is faith, meditation, divine unity, equality for all mankind, engaging in service for justice. But at the same time, they are also trained to fight if they are messed with. And bear in mind, considering where they have been messed with. So, a very peace loving religion, but at the same time, one willing to defend itself if it is wronged. And there's about 25 to 30 million Sikhs in the world, and a good population at 13 in Orchard Lake, just fairly close to us. Okay, the scientific revolution. Now we're moving away from religion into science here. And this was a 17th century movement that said astronomy, physics, chemistry. That's how you understand the world. And it brought these fathers, Copernicus, Brahe, Kepler, Galileo, and they had to tread lightly as they made their discoveries because it conflicted with the church often. So what this created was a more scientific, empirical worldview in contrast to a faith-based worldview. Copernicus, there's the statue outside the Detroit Library. He's considered the father of the scientific revolution. He discovered we weren't a geocentric, or the Earth, the center of the universe. Now, this was believed to be true for 1900 years. He proposed a heliocentric model, which was the sun was the center of the universe. And he released his findings at the end of his life to avoid persecution, which is probably a smart move considering the context of the time. Galileo is another father of the revolution, using that telescope. Now, he did face persecution for the revealing of the truth and was put on house arrest. And it wasn't until 1992 that the church asked for forgiveness. Sir Isaac Newton and his three laws that you knew very well. Good job, science department. These were the three laws that governed motion in the universe. But by the end of Newton's time, the scientific revolution was reaching the end because that scientific influence and literacy had already permeated most of educated Europe. Now, related to the scientific revolution, okay, this was The scientific revolution was the foundation of this, was the European Enlightenment, 18th century movement that emphasized reason, liberty, progress, tolerance, fraternity, constitutional government, separation of church and state. Looks like America to me, and it influenced pretty much any modern democratic nation with their thinking. So these thinkers came from America and Europe, including the man who wrote our Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Now, here's a couple examples. Voltaire, French philosopher, Enlightenment philosopher, his ideas were behind the French Revolution, which became the template for pretty much all the other revolutions that followed. And another guy, Condorcet, sorry, my French accent isn't very good, very similar as an example of Enlightenment thinkers and their effects. Okay, so that ends chapter 7. So in addition to these terms, please turn in the LEQ, SAQ, and MCQ. And then we will move on to chapter 8. And we're going to get into revolutions, one of my favorite topics. So hopefully you remember these, and I appreciate you watching.